5 years, one intern, every secret in his empire copied, cataloged, waiting. He saw love, she saw his empire's ruin. The headline would read that way someday if anyone ever printed what Emma Roberts had done. For now the story lived in the thin blue light of a late-night office, in a folder labeled with a date and a name that made her heartbeat uneven. Andrew Harris, Medical. She breathed in the sterile air of the server room like a confession, closed the encrypted window, and closed her eyes for a count of 3 before logging off. By day she answered to Michael Frost, calendars, travel itineraries, the precise tone with which his coffee would be served. She was the kind of assistant who made herself invisible in public and indispensable in private. By night she turned into something the Empire's accountants and enforcers would never recognize, an archivist of betrayal, the keeper of 14,000 files and 1,000 more fragments of lives frozen on camera. She did it because one man's life sat in a hospital room with a waiting list and a heart that had begun to fail on a timetable. Andrew Harris did not remember who he had been for most of his life. Memory had come back to him in flashes, faces like Polaroids, a laugh that felt like sunlight, a hand he could not place, then gone. Doctors called it amnesia layered over chronic heart failure. They used measured phrases and prognosis percentages. For Emma, the terms were more brutal. Months, money. A donor match was unlikely without expedited priority. There were ways around the queue if the right levers were pulled. Those levers belonged to men who measured everything in leverage. At 27, Emma had learned to read rooms by watching the way men moved when they believed power went unchecked. Michael Frost moved with a certainty that made people orbit him. Aides hurried, lawyers smiled without teeth. He was handsome in a way the press used to soften headlines, high cheekbones, eyes like dark weather. He could be tender in private, a small, startling tenderness that softened the patronizing tone he used with everyone else. He liked to think he saw people. That belief was part of what made him dangerous. 3 meetings before lunch, Michael said that morning as Emma handed over his schedule. Block the afternoon, I'm seeing Isabella. Emma felt the word Isabella like a signal. New CEO, fresh ambitions, a vein of war through the Frost Group already humming louder. Mergers meant money and scrutiny. Mergers meant auditors, and auditors were doors that could not be opened without knives. Emma's hands closed into fists for a second. Andrew's name lived under a post-it on her phone. Emergency contact for a hospital social worker. Dates, bills, her ledger of favors owed and favors extracted. You look tired, Michael added, idly, as if she were a chair she might replace. I forced a smile. No, sir, I'll be here.
She would not be at the office, not fully, but she would be in both places at once. The day would be calendared and bright, public and perfunctory. The night would be different. Downloads, decoding, the careful cut and paste of a life that would run parallel to his. Emma's rituals were small and precise. She moved through the Frost Group with a practiced anonymity, a dress that read competent instead of seductive, hair pulled back so she could hide the microphone she sometimes wore in jobbing with journalists. She was unremarkable in the ways that mattered. People didn't look twice at the intern who made sure everything ran. That invisibility had been her greatest advantage for 5 years. Nobody suspected that the woman who made coffee and scheduled calls also walked home with the bones of an empire on a thumb drive. She was not a thief for the thrill. She stole for a reason that could not be neatly quantified in spreadsheets. Andrew was not her husband or brother. He was a past love, a patient in a faded hospital ward who had once loved her without reserve. Memory, when it returned, came wrapped in a stranger's voice. At first she had thought about asking Michael for help. He had means, he had influence. But Michael's world was a web. Kindness came with interest attached, and she had learned that favors from people like him always cost more than they were worth. So she took matters into her own hands. She copied surveillance tapes from boardroom meetings, financial models, offhand conversations that showed where contracts could be shifted, who'd been paid what, and the private quarrels that would never reach the press. She kept everything in a shadow archive she called half in humor and half in resolve, the ledger. It was not only data, it was a map of where leverage could be applied. On a Friday in late November, the city smelled like rain and cold glass. The company had a gala, an ostentatious, carefully curated evening meant to show the world that Frost Group was unassailable under Isabella's guidance. Emma wore a soft black dress. The slit was modest, the jewelry borrowed from a friend. She was supposed to be a shadow at the edge of tables, a note writer, an evenly voiced whisper of logistics. She was also scheduled to meet a contact from a small investment firm who could funnel the sort of cash that bend the rules on donor accounts. The contact would not ask where the money came from. He would merely accept it if the price appeared right. The gala smelled like perfume and ambition. Chiffon brushed champagne, and men traded pitches like cards. Michael found Emma with a glass in his hand and a look that suggested surprise had only recently learned manners.
"You look good tonight," he said, as if he were reminding himself she was human. He placed his hand on her back in a way that felt like both ownership and care. She let him touch her. Sometimes his presumption worked in her favor. Sometimes it made her stomach tighten.
Tonight, she needed him to be blind. "Everything's arranged," she said, passing him a small envelope containing the plan for his speech. Her voice was smooth. "You'll be fine." "You always say that." His laugh was low. "You know, Emma, I never expected to be so comforted by an assistant." Emma's throat tightened. Comfort and possession were close cousins in Michael's vocabulary. He saw devotion and called it love. He did not see the ledger or the donor names or the nights she spent at Andrew's bedside, soothing a man who sometimes did not know her name. Across the room, Isabella moved like a current, charismatic, poised, dangerous in a tailored suit. She had the smile of someone who had spent her life collecting advantages and converting them into influence. At her side was a white-haired board member with a jaw like a cliff. The merger talks had been months of quiet power plays. Everyone in the room watched the way Isabella and Michael exchanged glances, competitors dressed as partners. Emma felt the pressure tighten. It had been almost 5 years since she began siphoning files, first small, then bigger, until she had something that could ruin reputations and topple deals. She had told herself a simple fiction to sleep, that the empire would still stand when she was finished. That fiction now seemed hopelessly naive. Everything she had amassed was a knife with a double edge, enough to buy a life, enough to slice a legacy. When the evening wound toward the speech, Emma slipped away to the service corridor and to the small janitor's closet where she had hidden her tools for emergencies, an old laptop with an impenetrable case, chargers that only she used, a backup thumb drive. She did not need to instruct anyone how it worked. She only needed to be fast and quiet. In the dark, her phone buzzed, a text from the hospital. Andrew had taken a bad turn. He had stable vitals, but the doctors had found new complications. "We need to escalate," the message read. Her hands shook. She closed the message and pressed her palms into the tile like someone trying to pin herself down. They said months. They said urgent. To them, Andrew was a case file. To her, he was the voice that had once said her name as if it were the only truth in the world. The ledger was not a game. It was a lifeline. She made the call that night. There were 1,000 ways to move money around the world. She knew men with the discretion to slip payments through a maze and make them appear as philanthropy or offshore transfers. She knew people who could influence waitlists, doctors with private practices, schedulers who took bribes in envelopes. She hated herself for every call she made. She loved Andrew enough to keep doing it. "Stay put," Michael's voice said in her ear later, warm and private. "We can go outside." He offered his arm as if the two of them were part of a tableau nobody had permission to enter.
She let him guide her onto the terrace where the city unfurled in neon and rain. He looked at her with old, confusing tenderness. "Why are you helping me so much?" Michael asked, leaning against the low wall. "Most people want something. You do things that don't look like they're for the ledger." Her fingers closed on the rim of her glass. "People do what they have to do," she said, neutral. She could not tell him the truth. It would break everything. He smiled sadly. "I don't know if I ever deserved it." There was an honesty in his voice now that made her think maybe he was something other than what he showed the public. "But I don't want to lose you." He didn't mean the way she wanted him to mean it. He meant possession. He meant an easing of the ledger. He meant the kind of affection that asked for loyalty first and tenderness later. He thought his generosity could be payment for devotion. He could not imagine someone stealing from his family's vault. On the way back in, as guests filtered beneath crystal chandeliers, an attendant whispered something into Emma's ear. A file had appeared on the Frost Group's internal audit queue, a small inconsistency in server logs. Someone was paying attention. The phrase lodged like a pin in her ribs. Inconsistencies. She smiled in public, murmured that she would look into it, and walked faster. 2 nights later, in the pale light of a hospital corridor, Andrew laughed at a joke that had no punchline, and then grew suddenly serious, his fingers searching the air as if for a second hand. "Emma," he said, and there was the soft, stunned recognition she had died to hear. He tilted his head and frowned. "You're here. You always are." It was the clearest moment she had had in months. His eyes lingered on hers in that way of someone reconnecting to a familiar shore. She thought, if I could buy a year, he would remember me more. If I could buy a month, he might sleep without fear. She slid a folded envelope into his pocket like a magician palming a card,
and watched the way his fingers closed over it without asking questions. The veil between them was fragile and luminous. But the hospital's price was unbending. The tests, the specialists, the private room fee that insurance would not cover. Money disappeared faster than she could make it. And every night, when she returned to the stale glow of the ledger, she felt the weight of what she had taken. Each file felt heavier than the last. The first time she leveraged a tape, it was small, a petty payoff disguised as hush money. A junior executive had been selling small vendor contracts to a friend. Emma arranged a meeting, handed the man a folder with a thin packet of cash and a single page, a transcript of a conversation she had recorded months earlier. The man swallowed and nodded. He would sign the cancellation. Nothing would be public. It bought her a son that saved 1 week of Andrew's care. The next time the price rose, and again.
Word traveled in the corridors of power like a rumor in a small town. Frost employees felt a new undercurrent, an invisible hand adjusting stitch by stitch. People began to ask whispered questions about payments, consulting fees, and the unusual appearance of contracts slipping through audits. Isabella prowled the financial reports with the appetite of a predator smelling weakness. The merger negotiations, once fluid and promising, acquired small, jagged fractures. "You're bleeding us," Isabella said at the board meeting, the words like knives. Her voice never rose, but the room fell into a hush that suggested the floor might open. Someone is siphoning funds, making small adjustments. Michael's expression hardened. "We'll find it." They would find it, Emma thought. They would find it when she could not stop them. They might trace the leaks back to her, to the long tail of favors she had negotiated. She made a list of people she could trust. 1, maybe 2. The rest were liabilities. The ledger was a ship with hidden leaks, and she kept bailing water with everything she had. A week before the planned merger announcement, her contact sent her a file, a deleted surveillance clip recovered from a camera in a private suite. It had been erased months before, the kind of thing only someone with deep access could resurrect. The thumbnail was grainy, the timecode was faded. She opened it on a laptop in the storeroom of a dry cleaner where no one would look twice. On the screen, a younger man sat at a table across from a man who radiated self-assurance. For a moment, she thought the footage was from a decade ago. Different hair, different suits, but then the camera adjusted, and the younger man's profile was uncannily familiar. He had the same eyes Andrew had when they were struck by the same wave of remembered affection. In the clip, he laughed at something, and then missed a beat, clutching his chest as if surprised by pain. The other man slid an envelope across the table. Emma's stomach dropped. The younger man's name tag was partially visible. A. Harris. It was him. The clip showed Andrew at a meeting where a contract was discussed, a man I recognized from Frost's earlier files, the name of an offshore consultant, a ghost company that showed up in frozen ledgers. The camera angle captured a moment of recognition between the consultant and an executive who bore a striking resemblance to someone in Michael's inner circle. Her breath hitched. She rewound, zoomed in with hands that trembled. The clip was a map that connected Andrew to a world she had sworn to exploit and a world she had sworn to protect. If Andrew had ties to Frost's past, if those ties were the reason his memory was fragmented, if worse, Andrew had been involved in a deal that went wrong, then everything suddenly had new, terrible stakes. She thought about telling Andrew the truth, that his missing memories held not only a life, but also a ledger of transactions that men wanted buried. She thought about telling Michael, who watched her with possessive tenderness and would surely try to negotiate a solution that preserved his interests before anyone else's. She thought about Isabella, who would use the clip like a scalpel. Every confession was a risk. That night, the hospital called with bad news. Andrew's condition had worsened. Complications had progressed faster than scans had predicted. They had found potential candidates for a transplant, but the window was narrow. Priority lists could be manipulated with money and influence, suitably applied. Emma imagined a courtroom of reputations she could topple in exchange for a place on that list. She imagined the fury of men whose empires she could unpick, file by file. She imagined Andrew waking up with a memory that might reveal a truth fatal to the Frost dynasty. "Why didn't you tell me?" Andrew asked in a low voice when he woke briefly, confusion knitting his brow. "Why didn't you—" She pressed his hand. "Because I wanted to remember you without asking you to owe me anything." His eyes clouded in a way that suggested he would never understand the ledger, the bank transfers, the hours she had spent negotiating his life away. Love and debt were not the same. She could no longer tell which one she was trading.
The next day, someone called Emma's phone and did not speak. The silence stretched into static, then a click. She had felt that kind of silence before, the kind that carried a warning. It meant someone had watched a file, traced a shadow, and decided to test the edges. She started closing doors. She stopped meeting in the janitor's closet. She stored the laptop with an extra battery in a locker under an assumed name. She sent the largest, riskiest files to an archive she had buried off-site, a place of cold servers and dead letter returns. She told herself it was enough. She was wrong. A week later, a piece of the ledger surfaced in an impossible place, an encrypted email to a journalist with a line that read, simply, "We have more." It was calculated to appear as a leak, not a hack, suggesting insider knowledge and a source brave enough to throw a lit match into a press room. The journalist called. The journalist wanted answers. The journalist wanted proof. Emma sat at the back of a cafe, the city raining outside, and watched the reporter's fingers move across his phone. She felt the room shrink. She could imagine the headlines already, frosty fonts and moral outrage, the kind that would cascade into regulatory scrutiny, stock dips, perhaps arrests. She could also imagine Andrew waking up in a new bed, with a future in a world that had been, for a night, lit anew. She could not decide whether she was more terrified of being exposed, or of continuing to be the architect of a life built on secrets. In the quiet of that cafe, a message arrived from an unknown number. "We know what you're doing. Stop now." Her heart kicked in her ribs.
Someone had followed her ledger long enough to put the pieces together. The message was both a threat and an offer. Stop, and nothing happens. Continue, and the unknown sender promised chaos. Or worse, the message might mean, "We know some of what you have, but not all. We'll take what we need." She realized then that her thefts had a life of their own. They had started as a way to save one life and had metastasized into a political weapon she was barely able to wield. The files were no longer only tools for her, they were objects of desire to any player watching the board. The things she had built to protect Andrew could now be used to destroy him. She thought of Michael's hand on her back, the way he spoke of loyalty as if it were obedience. She thought of Isabella, whose quiet hunger could turn into a vendetta. She thought of the journalist, whose ethics might waver if the right envelope arrived. She thought of Andrew, whose heart beat in a rhythm that could falter under the wrong stress. "You should come in," Michael said that night, when he had come by her apartment unannounced because he had a cluster of texts that read like a storm. He stood in the dark hallway as she packed a bag, because she had decided, though she had not told anyone, to vanish for a few days, to make a run to a safe house where she could think and move files without fear of being watched. "Why would I walk into your hands?" she asked. He made no move to take the bag. "I don't want you to leave," he said, and for the first time his voice had the flatness of someone needing a losing hand. "If you go, I'll lose you." Emma wanted to tell him the truth, that she had been stealing his life to save a man who might ruin him. That confession would be the kind that detonated the world in a single sentence. She folded the bag closed and stared at him until he looked away. "All right," she said finally, "I'll stay." Her face had the weariness of someone making a bargain with fire. "But I can't answer questions I don't have answers to, not now." He reached for her, gently, and for a moment she let herself be held. His hand on her back felt like a promise that could be undone the minute her ledger came into the light. He said, "We'll fix it, together." The word "together" pressed down like the hands of men who build empires, easy to offer, difficult to share. The week that followed moved with the electric speed of a chain reaction. The journalist published a small piece, a rumor of irregular payments, an anonymous tip alleging insider information. The stock skipped but did not tumble. Isabella called an emergency meeting, face composed like a stone. Michael paced and cussed without volume, a man who felt the world slipping from him in small increments. Emma kept working in the seams. She placed calls that made her stomach curl, asked favors she later resented, and then slept fitfully at Andrew's bedside. In the small hours, she watched the monitors and mouthed the names of machines and medicines she could not pronounce. Sometimes Andrew's hand would find hers, and he would squeeze like a man remembering a language he had once spoken fluently. "You ever think about what you'd do if you had to choose?" he asked one night, razor voice soft with medication. between two things you love? She wanted to answer truthfully. She wanted to tell him that she had already chosen and that the choosing had been messy and permanent. But the truth felt like a loaded pistol aimed at a mirror. "I'd risk everything," she said instead, "but I'd only do it if I knew it would help." He smiled in the way of a man not wholly certain of his own meaning. "That sounds like someone else I used to know." When she finally reached the file with the deleted clip she had found earlier, a new message blinked on her laptop. An attach was there from a source she had never seen before, a slip of correspondence between two executives referencing a name she recognized only as a code. The file contained a ledger page that connected the ghost company in Andrew's clip to a series of small transfers that, traced backward, pointed to contingency funds kept by a trust no journalist had ever uncovered. The trust had been set up years ago, before Michael took over the mantle, and its accounts were a broom for secrets. The implication was staggering. Andrew had been part of a transaction that had been quietly laundered through a network intended to shield the family. Had he been collateral? Had his memory loss been purchased or engineered to cover something worse? She could not tell, but she felt the angle of the knife. If she leaked the information in full, if she released the tapes and the ledger and every private email in her archive, Frost Group would not merely lose a merger, their entire public face might collapse. Regulators would come, prosecutors would circle, families allied by marriage and deal would start to unwind. The ledger pulsed like a living thing under her hands. She imagined the consequences: boardrooms emptied, benefactors turning hostile, reputations carved up in the press. She imagined Andrew alive and whole, sitting across a table at a cafe without a drip in his arm, laughing at nothing in particular. But the ledger also risked revealing him, his connections, his old business, the tryst that might have been the trigger for the fall. There were choices that felt like locks that could not be undone. Release the files and save a life while destroying a dynasty. Keep them hidden and watch Andrew's heart fail with clean hands. She had never believed in absolutes. Everything she had done had always been a gradient, moral one day, immoral the next. A message arrived that night with a single line: "You have until midnight Sunday. Choose." Her phone had never once felt heavier. She spent the next hour in a kind of feverish calm, arranging the files she might release, cataloging what to expose and what to withhold. She imagined the world with Frost Group announced as a corporation of criminals and the faces of the people who would lose everything. She imagined taking that particular kind of revenge and finding it tasteless. At 2 a.m, she walked to the place on the river where the city's lights sank and breathed the cold air into her lungs until the ache in her chest settled into a dull thing. Andrew's name lived in the folds of her coat like a small animal. She wanted to believe somehow her thefts would look heroic in time, that the ledger would be placed in the center of the moral debate, and people would nod and say, yes, she was right. But people lived in absolutes and rarely forgave the means, even when the end glowed sanctified. She did not have a plan that felt clean. She had a plan that felt necessary. Back at the apartment, the phone glowed with another message. This time it wasn't typed. It was a voicemail from an unknown number. She pressed play. A voice, smoothed with indifferent menace, said, "You've been busy. Don't make us think you're reckless. We can help you, or we can make you stop." Emma listened, the words like a cold stone rolling down her throat. Whoever they were, they knew enough to scare her. They had access to channels she had thought only she could traverse. They could make demands, or threats, or both. She turned the laptop on and opened the ledger. Files cascaded like snow. A folder named Transfer History blinked. A folder named Surveillance Deleted glared back. The room hummed with electricity and one small thought. There was no way to win a war that required you to be invisible and dishonest for 5 years and still claim the moral high ground. Somewhere in the city a siren wailed, cutting the night like a seam. Emma sat down at the table, her fingers tapping the keys in a rhythm that was half prayer and half calculation. She set up layers of contingency she had never thought she would need, copies of the ledger in places she trusted least, offices she would never visit again.
She arranged false trails for predators who would follow digital footprints. She thought of Michael's hand on her back. She thought of Isabella's cold smile. She thought of the journalist's curiosity. And she thought of Andrew, whose fingers had closed on the envelope she had slipped into his pocket, as if the money might hold a new kind of memory inside it. There was a knock at the door. Emma stood with the laptop humming, fingerprints on its gloss. She checked the peephole. A man in a raincoat stood in the wet light. His face was unfamiliar. He lifted his hand in a small, polite salute. He said nothing through the door. The knock came again, firmer this time. She opened the door a sliver. "Can I help you?" she asked, trying to keep the tremor out of her voice.
He pushed forward slightly, just enough to show his face. "Miss Roberts?" He spoke like someone who had rehearsed 1,000 eventualities. He stepped back and put a card into her hand. On it was a name she had seen once in passing in the company roster. Ashton Reed, security consultant. She knew the name as someone who could be an enforcer or a cleaner. "You don't look right," he said. "Someone's been watching. We need to talk about your mistakes." Emma's mouth went dry. The ledger felt suddenly like a living animal beneath a too thin sheet. Her throat closed. "How much do you know?" she whispered. "As much as it takes," Ashton said, and there was no pity in his voice. "We can protect you, or we can make sure you disappear." Emma thought of Andrew in his hospital bed, his fingers closed around envelopes and thimbled promises. She thought of the story the journalist might publish if he put the clip together with the ledger. She thought of the way Michael had touched her, and how love in his world often meant contracts and pressures in exchange. She closed the door and leaned against it, the rain noise like a percussion in the dark. There was a second knock, softer, almost solicitous. The lines were tightening. The ledger had become a prize, a weapon, a debt. The people who wanted it wanted more than power. They wanted control. Emma set her jaw and picked up the laptop. She began to move files again, slower this time and more precisely. She exported a copy of the deleted clip, the one with Andrew at the table in the envelope. She encrypted it and embedded in it a single message. "If anything happens to me, release this to the press, to the regulators, to the world." She thought of the cost. She knew the calculation she was making. Expose the files and possibly save Andrew, but ensure the ruin of the Frost Empire. Keep them hidden and let Andrew's heart run to its end. She did not know if she had the right to make that decision. She only knew that she had the power to choose. At 3 in the morning, she drove to the hospital in a borrowed car, moving like a woman walking on ice, hands tight on the steering wheel. The city blurred. The ledger sat in the passenger seat like an accusation. The voicemail had said they could help or stop. She had not known which would be worse. Andrew slept when she arrived, pale and softened by morphine. Machines puffed and beeped beside him. She sat in a chair by the bed and watched his chest rise and fall like waves she could not navigate. She imagined giving the files to someone who could buy him a new heart and then walk away from the wreckage. She imagined taking the files and using them to blackmail, to force the trust accounts open. She imagined walking into Michael's office and placing the ledger on his desk and watching him watch it. A nurse came in and adjusted his syringe. She left without comment. When the door closed, Emma leaned over him and whispered, as if confession could change fate, "Do you remember me at all?" His eyelids fluttered. "You're the only thing that makes sense," he said, "but the rest is fog." She took his hand and held it like someone trying to anchor a drowning man. A part of her wanted to surrender everything in exchange for his survival. Another part hated herself for the way she had already started to rewrite morality in her head. Back at the Frost building the next morning, a boardroom filled with men and women who had never once thought themselves vulnerable was in meltdown. Isabella stood like a general. Michael sat rigid like a man who had lost his map. The leaked article had been mild, a rumor, but the company's legal team had already been served with preliminary subpoenas. The trust accounts had been called into question by an anonymous tip. The media smelled blood and moved in. In a small corner office, a junior associate received an anonymous package, a USB and a note reading simply, "Pay attention." The file contained a snippet of a conversation intercepted months earlier, proof that a small vendor contract had been steered through a shell company. It was enough to make executives sweat and to force the legal department into defensive motion. It was not enough to topple an empire yet. Emma watched the news feed on her phone with a cold, steady anger. The world was beginning to turn exactly as she feared.
the ledger's tremor had become a ripple. Then came the call she most dreaded. Michael asked, quietly, to meet. He wanted to know what was true. He wanted to know whether the person he had quietly trusted, a woman he treated with rare, private softness, was the source of the leaks. He said, "If you did this, I need to know why." Emma could have lied. She could have protected herself. Instead, she took a breath and told him something that was true, but not the whole truth. "I did what I had to do," she said, "not for me." He stared at her, as if willing the rest of the sentence to appear. "For Andrew." The name landed in the room like a hand grenade. Michael's face went through a dozen emotions: betrayal, incredulity, hurt, then a kind of animal fury the boardroom had never seen him show. He had thought he had given her kindness. He had thought that kindness bought loyalty. He had not expected this. "You stole for us for him?" he asked. "Do you understand what you've done?" She did. She understood fully. She also understood what would happen next. The ledger would be used against them in ways that would ripple outward. Lawsuits, collapsing deals. People would be jailed, or at least indicted. The public would have its spectacle. Andrew might live, or he might be safe for a time under a new name, burned and grateful and living with a new debt to a woman who had made herself monstrous for him. Michael reached out like a man trying to save a drowning person, and instead got splinters.
"I love you," he said suddenly, the confession raw. "I don't know when it started, but Emma laughed then, a sound without humor. "You love the idea of me," she said. "You love what I do for you. You love the way you think you saved me because you gave me a job. You don't love the ledger." His face fell. The room echoed with the small totality of that sentence. He had expected devotion, not a moral calculus. Outside, a car rolled by, and the world continued like it always had. People rushing, commuters on their way to offices that made decisions with lives attached. Inside, reputations shifted like tectonic plates. A new file appeared in Emma's inbox, a short, clipped message and an attachment. She clicked it open with a kind of hollow curiosity. The file was a surveillance clip, new, high resolution, showing a handoff in a parking garage. The man on camera looked like someone Emma had seen at the periphery of Frost's events. The handoff involved a small box, the kind you use to move physical documents. The camera caught a face in profile, Michael's. Emma watched the footage 3 times. Then the phone in her pocket buzzed. A text from an unknown number read, "Release or we will." She realized with the cold clarity of someone finally mapping a trap that someone had orchestrated this narrative, someone who wanted the ledger released, but also wanted to control the fallout. They were not interested in truth. They were interested in spectacle. They were trying to push her into a corner where any move she made would produce their desired outcome. She had been a manipulator of small things. Now she was a pawn in a larger game. The night before the deadline, she went to the one place she had always avoided, the small cafe where she and Andrew had first fallen asleep on each other's shoulders, where memory had been a warmth and not a burden. She sat at the table where they had once whispered like children and stared into the middle distance. A woman came in and sat opposite her, unannounced. Dark hair, a face not unfamiliar in the way of someone who had been on television once and smiled for the camera. Isabella. "You wound the company," Isabella said quietly. "You wound people who trusted you." Emma could have deflected. She could have lied. Instead, she put everything on the table. Not the ledger itself, that was a last resort, but the shape of the choice. "I can save him," she said. I can get Andrew a transplant," Emma finished, the words falling out like a bargain she hadn't meant to make aloud. Isabella's eyes narrowed, and for a second the room smelled like polished wood and old money. Isabella sat back and folded her hands, the kind of motion that had ended entire careers before breakfast. "You can get him a transplant," she repeated, as if testing how it sounded when ownership moved from hope into the ledger of consequence. "And you will give me the ledger." Emma felt her throat close. "I won't hand over everything." Isabella's smile sharpened. "You'll hand over enough. Enough to let me control the narrative. Enough to make sure the regulators and the press see only what I want them to see. We stabilize the stock, we keep key families intact, and he gets onto the list under a private program." She leaned forward. We bury the worst. You get him a chance. It was an offer wrapped in a threat and scented with a strange mercy. Isabella framed it as corporate triage. Underneath it lay a simple calculus: power politely redistributed. Emma thought of Andrew's fingers closing around an envelope the way someone might grip a lifeline. She thought of the ledger as a rifle pointed at a cathedral. She wanted to believe in Isabella's civility, but the woman had shark's teeth and wore diplomacy like armor. "What do you want in return?" Emma asked, because bargaining was the one language she still had fluency in. "Access," Isabella said. "A cut of your archive, a roadmap. We'll place you, quietly, into an agreement where you relinquish ownership, and in exchange we anonymize certain elements. We can keep Michael at the helm, with conditions. We secure Andrew. You go into witness protection if you like. No arrests if you cooperate." Emma pictured herself reinvented in a town with no acknowledgments, no calls, no ledger on a laptop. It was a faint, cold comfort. She pictured Andrew awake and whole, and smiling like someone fishing for sunlight. The promise held both, his life and the ruin of a dynasty, carefully pruned to preserve those Isabella deemed valuable. "If I hand it to you," Emma said finally, "you'll protect him and you'll protect me?" "You'll be safe enough," Isabella corrected gently. "Safe enough for the practical truths of life." Emma wanted the neat line that would let her sleep. Sign this and Andrew lives, the rest untidy but survivable. But nothing in the last 5 years had ever been neat. The ledger had teeth. Once shown, it gnawed. She left Isabella with a non-answer and a promise to consider. As she walked down the marble corridor, the fluorescent lights found all her flaws and warmed none. She could feel the ledger in her bag like a second pulse. Outside the building, rain had begun again, as if the sky had decided to wash the city clean of its own choices. Her phone buzzed. Unknown number. A single line. "Release or we will." She closed her eyes and let the city breathe around her. The demand was not negotiable. Whoever was watching, someone with access to clips and anonymous emails and delivery men in raincoats, knew how to steer public fury. They wanted spectacle. They wanted to force her hand. She had a choice she had never meant to make. Hand the ledger to a woman whose hands are steady and cold, and hope that Isabella's mercy was a useful fiction, or throw the ledger into the arena and hope the outcry bought Andrew a life at the cost of an empire.
She had always imagined herself a secret rescuer, a shadow that could steal votes and bargains in the night without ever being seen. Now the shadow had to step into the light. At the hospital, Andrew's monitors whispered in regular rhythms. He slept with a sort of fragile trust. Eyes shuddered like someone pressing a palm over an old photograph to keep it from flaking. Emma sat in the chair and watched him breathe, counting the beats as if they were prayers. The phone in her bag was a small stone of decisions. Isabella's offer, the anonymous ultimatum, Michael's private ask to stay, the journalist's curiosity. She thought of Michael's hand on her back in the marble glow of the gala terrace, the way he'd told her he might lose her, as if someone could own a life. She thought of Andrew's fingers closing on nothing and letting it seem like everything. The ledger felt heavier than it had the night she first copied a petty vendor contract, heavy enough to shatter a world. She used the ledger the way she had used it for 5 years, not to command but to bargain, not to instruct anyone in how to break systems, but to barter the presence of truth for the protection of a life. She contacted an intermediary who had never asked for names and slipped him an encrypted note. She told him she needed a surgeon, a quiet program, payment that could not be traced to the Frost Trust accounts, and the fastest possible chance of priority. The intermediary asked for a price, and she told him the ledger. He did not bat an eye. In a way, Emma was making a virtue out of ruin. The only path to Andrew's survival now ran through someone else's appetite for spectacle. If she released everything, the world would audit the Frost estate and likely find more than misplaced contracts, payments, shadow companies, late-night envelopes. She didn't know if any prosecutors would have the stomach to pursue it all, but she knew the damage a sustained scandal could wreak on a family whose value hinged on reputation. She sat at Andrew's bedside that night and finally whispered the story she'd never managed to tell him in full. The ledger, the slow theft, the way every file had been a fingernail by which she clung to hope. His lips moved around her name. "Emma," he breathed, and for the first time in months,
The sound was not an accusation, but an anchor. "You have to trust me," she said. "I'm trying to get you a chance." He squeezed her hand with more strength than the medication should have allowed. "Then do it," he said, and the certainty in his voice unsettled her. It was not the feint of someone who wanted to save a life at all costs. It was the clarity of someone exhausted by waiting. Do it and come back. She did not know where back was anymore. The next morning, a new leak punctured the news cycle. A high-resolution clip of a handoff in a parking garage. The angle was familiar, the composition cinematic, the evidence crisp.
A boxed parcel, a profile of a suited man, Michael's face in an unfortunate slope. The caption read, "Confirmation? Frost handoff caught on tape." Boardrooms at Frost filled with people who had once believed themselves immune to scandal. In an emergency meeting, Isabella maintained her composure, while stress landing like artillery shells on the legal team. Michael's face was a study in shock and rage, not at the footage itself, but at the knowledge that someone inside the frost-smooth engine of his company had the appetite to make the family bleed. Emma saw the clip on her own phone and understood, with a clarity that felt like frozen water cracking, what it would demand of her. The anonymous numbers ultimatum had not been idle. Whoever pressed the board had a strategy that would either force an honest purge or manufacture a spectacle that would serve someone else's rise. She drove to the small cafe that had once been a shore for simpler confessions and found Isabella already seated with coffee gone cold. Isabella tapped her fingers on the table like someone composing sentences for an obituary. "I can control this," Isabella said. "I can control the narrative, Ms. Roberts. Give me enough and I can direct the cameras away from the worst things. Michael loses a little shine. You get Andrew saved. Nobody ends up in prison except maybe an expendable junior. We make it a purging, not an end." Emma had once believed in the secret that you could be useful and unseen. She now understood that usefulness had a cost. Isabella's world was one of trade-offs, a little truth for a lot of quiet. Emma had to decide whether she would permit the truth to be reworded as a mercy. "You'll keep Michael," Emma said. "You'll keep him as the face?" Isabella looked at her like someone about to outline terms. "No, I'll keep the board functional. Michael will remain because he has value in continuity. We can cut him loose later if we need. The markets fear chaos, not humility. After enough contrition, people forgive a man who looks repentant." It felt like a contract written in ash, salvation for Andrew under the terms of a carefully managed ruin. It was everything Emma feared, a bargain that preserved power for those who already possessed it. She could hand the ledger to Isabella and Andrew might live, though likely footnoted in a sanitized narrative that made the world comfortable again. Or she could release the ledger herself and force a public reckoning that would not spare the powerful and might spare no one. She asked for time, and Isabella gave her 24 hours. That was generous for a woman who lived in minutes. When she left the cafe, she found Ashton waiting in the rain-stained doorway outside, hands in his pockets as if he belonged nowhere and everywhere at once. "You should not be trusted," he said simply. I wanted to ask if he meant herself or Isabella or the anonymous voice. He said, "They're not cleaning the board, they're recycling it."
Whoever's pushing you wants to break Michael to make him useful. If you hand the ledger to Isabella, she will keep the parts that serve her and burn the rest. If you throw it into the press, he shrugged. You make martyrs, you make enemies. The problem, she thought, was that martyrs were not always heroes. Sometimes they were scapegoats. Sometimes the public's appetite stripped nuance until everything looked like a spectacle. The deadline arrived with weather, a thunderstorm that made the city's glass facades look like uneasy mirrors. Emma went to the hospital and sat in a chair that had become intimately familiar. Andrew's vitals were precarious but stable. The surgeon had been booked through a channel that smelled of hush and money. The risks were real. No one had guaranteed survival. No one had promised miracles. She had arranged for an encryption of the ledger to be sent to multiple outlets at once. A leading investigative journalist she'd met once in a lukewarm cafe, a whistleblower site that had never taken a bribe, a regulator's inbox, and a bank of foreign press outlets that would interpret a scandal in 1,000 languages. Her method was simple: redundancy. If one file was suppressed, another would speak. If one journalist folded under pressure, another would shout louder. She had also done something else. She gave a copy, just enough to embarrass but not to heal, to Isabella. The CEO accepted it like someone receiving a scalpel. "You do realize there will be consequences," Isabella sighed. "You do this and people die in the public sense." "I know," Emma answered. "You understand what ruining a house built on secrecy does?" Isabella asked, a softness in her tone that suggested she knew the answer. "Have you ever watched an entire network of people who feed other people die under the truth? You will expose not just Frost, but the clients and the beneficiaries who live well because someone else pays." Emma thought of Andrew and of the small, muffled life that had once fit inside his chest. She thought of the way hospitals stacked men like spare parts, and the way the wealthy bought time in private wings. She had not wanted to expose an entire ecology of debt and favor. She had wanted one bed. But once the ledger existed, there was no one way to use it. Isabella folded the file into her briefcase without ceremony and stood. "If you do this, I'll take steps to ensure Andrew's operation proceeds. You will be protected as best as we can. But no, this will not be pretty." Emma nodded. She had already made her choice. At noon, a branded push alert lit up phones across the country. Frost Group under investigation. Allegations of offshore transfers, shell firms, and deleted surveillance footage. The story carried a byline Emma's intermediary had promised would be uncorruptible. It was a careful enough release, enough to damage but not to destroy. It was what Isabella could live with.
But moments later, copies of private tapes began to appear on a whistleblower thread, intercut with internal emails and invoices and surveillance clips that were raw and unedited. Someone who wanted the ledger to be an instrument of total collapse had chosen the same hour to pull the ripcord. Emma watched the cascade from a chair in the hospital waiting room as Andrew's nurse updated a chart. The room felt suddenly thin, as if the fabric between them and the city had been sliced. On her phone, comments piled into a pile of opinion. Vultures feasting, a reckoning, a necessary purge, a freelance criminal. There were no unified narratives. There were only shards. Michael called. His voice had a tight edge. "What have you done?" "What I had to," she said. "Do you understand what you've started?" he asked. "Yes," she said. "I understand." At the Frost headquarters, panicked lawyers scanned the newly public files. Isabella moved like the calmest storm. She briefed regulators with a brittle courtesy while pressing a small army of PR operatives into defensive stances. The company's stock dipped in a way that made elder men grip tabletops in rooms designed for negotiation. The press camped at the Frost building like crows greedy for carrion. Emma heard the echo of her own actions reflected back as public fury, and she did not flinch. There are acts that exist only to be necessary. She had crossed into one. Andrew's operation was scheduled for late afternoon. Emma signed forms she could not read rightly because the legal jargon came to her like another language. The surgeon, anonymous and calm, promised a chance and not a guarantee. Emma watched the gurney roll out of the doors and felt as if something outside of her ribs had shifted. She had traded the ledger for the length of a life. And then, while the surgeon worked and the monitors whispered in corridors, the city did what cities do when truth comes to the surface. People scoured the internet and found scandal and history and little dirt that tasted like betrayal. The anonymous voices strategy came into relief. The leak had not only damaged Frost, it had put pressure on every player. Some stories were ugly and personal. One clip showed a private conversation between an executive and a politician, making arrangements that blurred ethics. Another showed a list of donors tied to hospitals with priority lists. The more the file spread, the more they fed on one another, producing a harvest of consequences. At the operation's close, the surgeon walked out with the look of someone who had done all he could and was unwilling to speak more than necessary. Andrew was moved to intensive care, hooked to devices that made the room feel like a tiny starship. Emma sat in the corner chair and let exhaustion eat her. She hadn't slept properly in months. The ledger had aged her like a woman who had spent a decade fighting high winds.
When Andrew woke, his eyes were watery and unclear at first, but focused on her like sunlight on a familiar face. There was a space in him that felt like an old knothole, a place where names had not yet settled. He blinked, recognition forming like breath on a window. "Emma?" he said. "Yes," she whispered. "It's me." He reached for her hand and gripped it like a man anchoring himself to shore. "You," he began, and his words came slow. "I remember you." She thought that might be enough. The ledger had brought a handful of memory back into a heart that had been a ledger of its own. He smiled weakly, tears cutting hot tracks down his face. "You did this." "No," Emma said. "I did what I had to." He watched the news on her phone and the lines of it, pictures of men who had once commanded rooms, now diminished. He saw Michael in a press conference, pale and arguing the company had made mistakes. He saw Isabella, suave and apologetic on a panel. He saw the clips that had once been private. His expression shifted.
not just to fear, but to a dawning comprehension. Am I connected to this? He asked quietly. The question weighted like a confession. Emma had been afraid of that question. She had feared his past might be the key that unspooled everything. There were connections, she admitted. You were at certain meetings. There were transactions. You were involved in something once. He was small with regret, as if all his missteps had been caught on the wrong side of a camera. I never meant, he began. No, she said. You didn't. The levity of moral absolution was anathema to Emma. There were no clear villains in this picture. There were only poor, compassionate, and monstrous acts braided together. Andrew's past was a folded map of choices that had been made by more than one man. He looked at her as if trying to find the place where his bones fit into an honest human story. In the weeks that followed, the governmental machinery did what it does when corporate scaffolding creaks. Subpoenas, hearings, resignations. The Frost Group's board fractured. Some members resigned with quiet dignity. Others were escorted out with less grace. Isabella maneuvered, shielding herself with fiduciary concern, though whispers in the press suggested she had known more, or at least had her own reasons for maintaining the balance of power. Michael, for his part, became a public study in a man exposed. He stood at the company's press stage and admitted to errors of judgment. It was not enough for the markets, and yet the admission was a step that took a political toll. Internally, he pushed for an internal audit, not only to salvage what he could, but to find the traitor within. He had thought the traitor was anyone, a competitor, a bribed junior, a spiteful ex. He had never imagined it would be someone he had been kind to. He came to see Emma in a waiting room that still had the scent of antiseptic and microwave coffee.
He sat across from her, and his face had the shape of a man trying to read a map that had changed while he blinked. You put me on the path, he said. You had access. You could have come to me. You don't keep people alive with PR, Michael, Emma said. You don't keep somebody alive in a private wing and call it mercy. You keep them alive with money that moves outside of audits and rules that conscript surgeons into favor. I didn't come to you because it would have cost too much. He stared at her for a long time, the kind of attention that pulled her into a spotlight she had tried to avoid. I thought you were loyal to me, he said, like a man saying grace in a room that held no prayer. I was loyal to someone else, she answered. I was loyal to Andrew. You used us, he said. I used what you let me touch, she said, and I used what I could take in the night. He reached out and took her hand. It was a clumsy, desperate reach. I love you, he said, and there was no artifice in the admission. It sounded less like possession in that small place, and more like the sting of a truth that had been slow to arrive. I don't know why or when. The sentence broke. Emma pulled her hand back as if from a hot stove. You love the person you thought I was, she said, and the words landed like a small object thrown from a dock. You love what I do for you, and what I've made myself into beside you. You don't love the ledger. He looked like a man who had been told the nature of the weather at the wrong moment. Are you saying you don't want me? He asked. I'm saying I can't let you build a life on what I took from the dark, she answered. I can't ask a man I care for to keep that when it kills people. He closed his eyes and let out a breath that was both apology and accusation. Why didn't you tell me at the start? Because you would have tied the debt to me and asked me to pay it with my life, she said. Because I thought I could do it without ruining you. Because I was wrong. The ruin came, but not the way she'd imagined. The press ate the ledger like a banquet. Frost's stock dropped until the numbers felt like ancient tombstones. Investigations followed, some swift and targeted, others slow and methodical. A few executives were indicted for bribery. A conservative handful faced charges for obscured payments. Isabella weathered storms that would have toppled lesser strategists. Michael's name was dragged through digests and broadcasts. He watched the company unravel, in part because he loved her, and in part because the truth had outlived its discretion. There were quieter wounds at home. Families allied by marriage felt cold distances. People who owed their lives to the trust accounts found themselves suddenly visible. The world shifted, and many small human debts became public goods. Emma turned herself in not long after the initial cascade.
It was a decision of calculus and conscience, to face prosecution rather than let others take blame for her choices. She thought, perhaps naively, that by doing so she might control the narrative long enough to protect Andrew from being vilified for his past. The cameras followed the story. Some called her hero, others a criminal. Courtrooms are places where the moral gradient is painted in harsh black strokes. Nuance is often an accessory no one can wear comfortably. In court,
She sat with fatigue under her eyes and a ledger redacted in ways that prosecutors insisted were necessary to protect unrelated witnesses. Evidence was tendered. Emails were read aloud that revealed less of the tender motives and more the specific criminal acts that had been committed. The law, in its steady hunger, could not accept sentiment as defense. Andrew visited as often as the rules allowed. The transplant had held in the way that medicine sometimes will, not miraculous, but sufficient. He remembered more with each day, and some memories were gentle, some jagged. He remembered Emma's hands on his wrist and the way she had fumbled to keep him alive. He remembered pieces of business dealings, the names that appeared in certain lists. He had a moment once where he put together an old photograph and said quietly, "I did terrible things, and I didn't know how to apologize." "You don't have to shoulder it alone," Emma said, and the line felt like a promise that could be both salvation and burden. In the public eye, Michael's confession of love became a complicated footnote. He made public statements of contrition and pledged to cooperate with investigators. In private, he visited Emma once outside of court, the hush of an empty hallway their only witness. "You could have saved yourself," he said. "I saved a man who needed a heart," she replied. "I didn't save myself." "You'll pay a price," he said. "You can help," she said. "Not by saving my reputation, Michael, by keeping our hospitals from being an economy for the rich." He was silent for a long time, the weight of what he had lost pressing like an unseen hand on his shoulder. "I don't know how to be without it," he admitted, voice small. The man whose life had been measured in acquisitions and press releases suddenly felt like someone whose map had been stripped of legend. Emma did not want pity. She wanted a recognition of the human calculus that had driven her, love legislating crime, sacrifice resculpting ethics. She wanted a public to ask instead, "What would you have done?" The question would remain unclean. The courts eventually sentenced her to a term that was a mixture of incarceration and community restitution, tempered by a public that found itself divided between outrage and empathy. Some felt the punishment too lenient, others thought it the only compassionate solution. In the end, laws are not perfect measures of moral clarity. They are social instruments intended to hold fractured things together.
Andrew, once out of the hospital and into a recovery routine that made him sometimes fragile and occasionally radiant, visited Emma as she prepared for a transfer to a facility that would be less punitive and more medical in tone. He stood in the small room where then cameras were forbidden, and he looked at her with a softness she could scarcely bear. "You ruined everything," he joked, a weak, bright sound. "No," she answered. "I ruined a foundation that needed to crumble. I saved you." "You saved me?" he asked. She considered the ledger and the pain it had cost them both. "I paid a price for you. That's not heroism. That's math." He smiled with the awkward charm of someone returning to a language. "Math can be enough," he said, "if it gets you back to me." Michael, by then, had retreated from the public glare to a life that measured itself in small kindnesses. He volunteered time at a clinic that accepted people who could not pay, and in private visited Andrew once, bringing tea he had not yet learned how to buy for the right people. There were no public reconciliations, except for those that press photographers orchestrated at the edges of parked cars. The human reconciliations were quieter, a hand on an elbow, a letter left on a chair. The Frost Group never rose to the heights it had once occupied. Pieces were sold off in forced auctions that made boardroom veterans wince. Some executives found new roles at other companies, others vanished into private consulting, where reputations were an asset to be repackaged. Isabella retained a seat in certain circles, but was forever watched like someone who had once held a flame to a family tree. Emma served her time with a kind of fierce, private dignity. She did not ask for forgiveness. She accepted consequence. She wrote letters to Andrew, and sometimes he visited, his memory prickling with fragments he shared like small gifts. He never remembered everything, but he remembered enough to have a life that was not tethered to the hospital's ballads. Once, late, she walked past the place where the Frost Building's shadow used to fall long and certain across the street. The glass face of a smaller corporate office caught the winter sun in a way that looked like a wound that had healed. Michael was inside the building, not as owner but as a visitor. He sat on a bench outside and watched people go by, his profile reflecting in that glass like a man willing to be less and more at once. They spoke without cameras, without the prying of headlines. He did not ask her to be his. He did not ask her to reclaim what had been lost. He simply said, "I saw something I didn't expect." She understood. He had seen love. Not the tidy, transactional form he had known, but the ragged, complicated proof that had made someone steal for another life. It was an understanding that came too late to preserve the empire, but not too late to salvage a human truth.
"You saw love," she replied, and the words were not forgiveness, but a recognition. She had wanted to be seen for something honest and human, and in that small corner they had it. He reached for her hand with a restraint that suggested he had been taught to take only what was offered. "I loved you," he said simply, the confession no longer a demand but an offering, in the way I could. Emma held his hand for a long moment and then withdrew. You loved an idea, she said. It's a different thing. They walked away from each other with the decent civility of two people who had shared a life and then given it away. The empire's ruins remained, visible as a slow public unspooling. The press moved on eventually, because the appetite for new spectacle is a kind of mercy that erases old scandals in favor of new ones. But the consequences bled into boardrooms, families, hospitals, and the small lives of people who had been collateral. In a quiet, low-lit room that smelled faintly of coffee and antiseptic, Andrew sat with his hands folded and a photograph between his fingers. It was an old snapshot of the two of them on a pier, sunburned and unafraid. He looked at it with a tender regret and placed it in a small box. Then he wrote a short note and slipped it to Emma the next time he visited. You did this, he wrote, not accusing, but acknowledging. You bought me time and you bought the truth. I don't know which is kinder. I only know I am here. Emma read it and let the warm salt of tears come. The ledger had made them both thieves and saviors in turns. The moral calculus had been ugly and magnificent in equal measure. Months after her sentence, when certain legal obligations had been met, and certain public hungers had dimmed into the dull, persistent murmur of everyday life, Emma walked out of a facility with a small bag and a longer shadow. People called her names in some quarters. Others said nothing and simply watched. She had learned that reputations are not repaired by time alone, but by acts that show what one does with the second chances one makes for others. She visited Andrew at an apartment that smelled of stew and sunlight, in the ordinary miracles of someone slowly reclaiming a life. He met her at the door and hugged her like a man with a ledger of his own, lists of wrongs and small, tenacious gratitudes. They did not speak of the ledger much. Some things had to be lived with, not explained. Michael, when he visited later, brought with him a small, anonymous packet of letters he had written, not confessions to the press, but apologies to people whose names had been in the columns. He did the quiet work that power demands when it has been humbled. He attempted to rescue what small things he could. It was not grand, it was useful. At night, when Emma lay awake, she would sometimes think about the ledger's teeth, and the way it had bitten and healed in the same motion.
She would think of rules and of exceptions, of how love could be a ledger of its own kind. She would think of the headline that had once chased her in the glow of other people's keys. For 5 years, the intern stole the boss's data. He saw love, she saw ruin. And she would understand exactly how the world might choose to understand them both. In a city that prized optics and balance sheets, their story was a crooked parable that refused easy moral lessons. People debated whether she was a criminal or a savior. Some said she had done both. The court had pronounced judgment for the law. Life had pronounced a different verdict. On an afternoon when the winter had thawed into a hesitant spring, Emma met Michael by a park bench where people walked dogs and children kicked a ball. The Frost building, smaller now in public reach, loomed in the distance as a monument to decisions made in darker hours. They sat in a silence that was not empty of feeling, but dense with what words could no longer hold. I don't regret saving him, Emma said quietly. Michael exhaled and let the breath hold for a beat. I don't regret knowing love, he answered, even if it came late. They watched a woman with a stroller pass by, and the world moved on. Behind them, the city hummed. Lawsuits, regrowth, new leadership in companies that had once been monoliths. The ledger remained, some of it public, some of it redacted and hidden, some of it unspoken. Its presence continued to change people, not always in ways anyone could have foreseen. In the end, the ledger did the work it had been built for. It bought a life and it took a world apart. It was both salvation and ruin, the two faces of a single coin flipped into an uncertain sky. Michael had seen love, an admission of feeling that rearranged him, showed him a life where tenderness mattered more than acquisition. Emma had seen ruin, an outcome she had set in motion because she believed a single life was worth more than an empire built on silence. They had both been right. When someone years later turned that headline into a question posed to a room of strangers, what would you risk to save someone you love? Emma thought of the ledger in her sleep and smiled with the small, private knowledge that some answers were not meant to be judged by strangers. They were meant to be lived. She walked on, carrying both the cost and the consequence as if they had become part of her bones. He stood in windows watching the city slow and learned, finally, that the warmth he had felt toward her had been a real thing, not a ledger to be made tidy, but an ache that persevered. He saw love, she saw ruin. Both were true, and both were theirs to bear.